The future queen could not even muster a fake smile for her new nephew, looking utterly desperate to escape the suffocatingly toxic room that had been engineered for the cameras. We are taken back to the high summer of 2019, to the supposedly joyous occasion of baby Archie Harrison's christening, an event that was meant to signify new life and familial unity, but instead laid bare a profound and irreparable fracture. Behind the thick stone walls of Windsor Castle, a holy sacrament was meticulously transformed into a stage-managed theatrical production, stripping away centuries of tradition in favor of a highly sanitized, obsessively controlled narrative. This was the precise moment the glittering illusion of the so-called Fab Four shattered into a million irrecoverable pieces, exposing a magnificent palace drama that had been brewing just out of the public's sight. What should have been a celebration of flesh and blood devolved into a masterclass in suppressed hostility, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that Catherine, the Princess of Wales, and her husband could no longer endure the punishing double life forced upon them by the Sussexes' insatiable demands. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe. These videos don't always get recommended, and this way you won't miss the next one. To truly grasp the gravity of this profound royal freeze, one must understand the unprecedented and frankly tiresome conditions under which this religious milestone was conducted. For generations, royal christenings, while private in their spiritual essence, have always offered a concession to the British public. A brief, joyous glimpse of the family walking to the church, a shared moment of national celebration that reinforces the bond between the monarchy and the people. However, Harry and Meghan, intoxicated by a peculiar blend of royal entitlement and Californian celebrity paranoia, demanded an absolute blackout, treating the arrival of their son not as a moment of dynastic continuity, but as heavily guarded intellectual property. They stubbornly refused to reveal the names of the godparents, a move that baffled constitutional experts and deeply insulted the very public that had so recently financed the multi-million-pound renovation of their Frogmore Cottage residence. This petulant insistence on a Hollywood-style fortress mentality created an atmosphere of deep suspicion and resentment, setting the stage for a family gathering where the air was already thick with unspoken grievances and profound mistrust before a single prayer had even been uttered. Behind the gilded doors, the reality of executing this unprecedented level of secrecy fell upon the shoulders of the royal household, creating an environment that bordered on the unbearable. According to a well-meaning staff member tasked with navigating this labyrinth of Sussex demands, the days leading up to the christening were characterized by a frantic, nervous energy, with courtiers tiptoeing around an increasingly volatile couple who seemed determined to find offense in every traditional suggestion. The private chapel at Windsor Castle, normally a place of quiet reflection and historical serenity, was treated more like a closed movie set, with strict instructions dictating who could stand where, who was permitted to speak, and how the entire tableau would be presented to a waiting, increasingly alienated world. One can only imagine the sheer exhaustion of the courtiers, attempting to seamlessly blend the solemnity of the Church of England with the relentless public relations machinery of a couple obsessed with controlling their global brand. The staff watched in quiet dismay as the spiritual significance of the day was entirely eclipsed by a desperate, highly orchestrated effort to project an image of idyllic bliss that everyone in the room knew was a complete and utter fabrication. As the day of the christening dawned, the wider British public was already beginning to sense the jarring dissonance between the Sussexes' words and their actions, a skepticism that would soon be entirely vindicated. There was a growing, palpable fatigue, with the endless lectures on compassion and community radiating from the couple, which stood in stark contrast to their hyper-defensive, aggressively exclusionary behavior regarding their own family milestones. The sheer cynicism of happily accepting the privileges, titles, and taxpayer-funded comforts of royal life while simultaneously treating the public as an intrusive enemy had not gone unnoticed by the press or the people. It is within this bubbling cauldron of public disapproval and internal family friction that the senior royals, bound by an unwavering sense of duty to the crown, prepared to descend upon Windsor, knowing full well they were walking into a highly choreographed trap. They were acutely aware that their mere presence was required not out of genuine familial affection, but to lend the necessary royal credibility to Meghan and Harry's independent brand, a bitter pill to swallow for an institution built on service rather than self-promotion. When Prince William and Catherine finally arrived for the ceremony, the dread radiating from them must have been almost physical in its intensity, a heavy burden carried silently beneath immaculately tailored clothing and stoic expressions. For the future king and queen, the journey to Windsor that morning was not filled with the typical light-hearted anticipation of welcoming a new nephew, but rather with the grim resolve of soldiers walking into a diplomatic minefield. Catherine, a woman renowned for her impeccable grace and her ability to radiate genuine warmth in even the most trying circumstances, found herself facing an impossible emotional conundrum. Her inner monologue must have been a chaotic swirl of duty, frustration, and a desperate desire to protect her own family's peace from the toxic whirlwind that seemed to follow the Sussexes wherever they went. She knew that every glance, every micro-expression, and every shift in posture would be scrutinized not just by the voracious media, but by a sister-in-law seemingly perpetually eager to manufacture a grievance from the slightest perceived slight. Stepping into the green drawing room for the official photographs, the senior royals were met with an atmosphere so suffocatingly tense that it has since become the stuff of dark palace legend. A source within the inner circle later revealed that the polite pleasantries exchanged between the two couples were practically delivered through gritted teeth, the air vibrating with a silent mutual disdain that no amount of floral arrangements or elegant lighting could possibly mask. Meghan, positioned at the center of the room, seemed to be holding court, basking in the triumph of having bent the ancient institution to her exacting, inflexible will, orchestrating the staging with the precise control of a television director. Yet, this performative joy was a terribly thin veneer, attempting to cover a profound and echoing emotional void that everyone present could feel deep in their bones. The room was divided not just by physical space, but by an unbridgeable chasm of values, with the dutiful restraint of the Cambridges crashing violently against the relentless, ego-driven demands of the Sussex PR machine. It is in these agonizingly protracted moments, waiting for the photographer's flash to capture a lie for eternity, that the true toll of this fractured relationship became undeniably clear to everyone involved. The sheer psychological pressure of having to pretend, of having to validate a narrative of unity that had been thoroughly decimated by months of leaks, demands, and behind-the-scenes tantrums, pushed the boundaries of royal endurance to their absolute breaking point. One must feel a profound sense of sympathy for those tasked with maintaining the dignified facade of the monarchy while being actively undermined from within by a couple playing a remarkably cynical game. As the photographer prepared to take the shot, the collective breath of the room was held, not in anticipation of a beautiful family portrait, but in a desperate shared hope that this excruciating charade would soon be over so they could all finally escape each other's presence. And in that crucial fraction of a second exposure, the camera, famously unforgiving and incapable of flattery, captured not the joyful celebration of a new life, but the devastating, undeniable death rattle of a family irrevocably torn apart. The telltale photograph that emerged from that afternoon at Windsor remains perhaps the most unintentionally honest document in the history of modern royal relations, stripping away the Sussexes' carefully curated veneer of domestic bliss. To the casual observer, it was a handsome family portrait, but to those of us who have spent decades decoding the subtle, silent language of the House of Windsor, it was a searing indictment of a relationship that had turned utterly radioactive. One's eyes are immediately drawn to Catherine, the Princess of Wales, who sat on that ornate green silk sofa looking less like a guest at a family celebration and more like a woman who had been physically cornered by a predator. Her posture was remarkably telling, perched on the very edge of the seat, her torso angled sharply away from Meghan, her limbs held in a state of high alert tension that screamed of a desperate primal urge to flee the room. This was not the relaxed, radiant Catherine the public had come to adore. This was a woman performing a duty under the most extreme psychological duress, her every muscle fiber rebelling against the forced proximity to a sister-in-law she could no longer trust. The facial expression Catherine offered the lens was a masterpiece of Victorian restraint, yet it betrayed a hollow, haunting sadness that no amount of royal training could entirely suppress. It was a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a brittle, paper-thin mask of civility that threatened to shatter at any moment under the sheer weight of the surrounding toxicity. A source within the inner circle later whispered that Catherine had spent the morning in a state of quiet, focused preparation, knowing that she would have to face the woman who had, by all accounts, previously brought her to tears over a flower girl's dress. The inner monologue of the future queen in that moment must have been a relentless mantra of endurance for the crown, a silent negotiation with her own dignity as she sat mere inches from the very source of her family's most recent and public humiliations. The pressure was not merely to look good for a photo, but to provide a stabilizing anchor for a monarchy being buffeted by the Sussexes' relentless ego-driven demands, all while her own sense of peace was being systematically dismantled by their presence. Contrasting this with Meghan's expression is a study in the art of performative satisfaction, a look of quiet triumph that seemed to radiate from the center of the frame. Meghan, ever the actress, appeared to be inhabiting the role of the serene, victorious mother, having successfully bent the British royal family to her will by dictating the terms of her son's entry into the church. There was a certain calculation in her gaze, a sense of, "I have won this round," as she sat flanked by the very people she would soon attempt to tear down in a series of lucrative media exposés. To a source behind closed doors, it was clear that Meghan viewed this portrait not as a family memento, but as a strategic asset, a visual confirmation of her status that she could wield against her detractors. The atmospheric pressure in that drawing room was so thick, so heavy with this unspoken power struggle, that it's a wonder the camera lens didn't crack under the strain of such profound mutual antipathy. The physical distance between the two women on that sofa, though seemingly small in inches, represented a vast, unbridgeable ideological canyon that would never be crossed again. Catherine's decision to wear her hair in a style that partially obscured her face, and her choice of a high-necked, modest dress, felt like a form of emotional armor, a way to retreat into herself while still being physically present. She was essentially building a fortress of one, protecting her inner self from the perceived insincerity and American-style emotional manipulation that she felt characterized the Sussex approach to royal life. According to someone close to palace circles, the silence in the room during the setup of the photograph was deafening, broken only by the sharp professional directions of the photographer and the forced, overly bright cooing of Meghan over her child, a sound that reportedly set the other royals' teeth on edge. It was a performance of motherhood designed to provoke an emotional response that the rest of the family simply could no longer muster. William's presence in the photograph only added to the sense of a family under siege, his stance behind Catherine looking more like a protective barricade than a supportive husband. He stood with his hands clasped firmly in front of him, his jaw set in a line of grim, suppressed fury that seemed to radiate a no-entry sign to his brother and sister-in-law. For William, seeing his wife, the woman who represents the very future and stability of the monarchy, forced into this humiliating charade, was a bridge too far. The inner monologue of the Duke of Cambridge was likely one of protective rage, a simmering resentment towards Harry for allowing this American interloper to disrupt the sanctuary of their family life and the dignity of their shared heritage. He wasn't just standing for a photo, he was standing guard over the institution he is destined to lead. His very posture an act of defiance against the Sussexes' attempts to rewrite the rules of royal engagement. The surrounding atmosphere of the Green Drawing Room, with its opulent history and portraits of ancestors who had navigated wars and crises, felt strangely insulted by the petty modern grievances playing out within its walls. The room itself seemed to groan under the weight of the falsity being manufactured for public consumption. A well-meaning staff member recalled that the lighting was adjusted multiple times to try and soften the hard edges of the royals' expressions, a technical attempt to fix a spiritual problem. No amount of professional lighting could hide the fact that these people were strangers to one another, bound by blood and title, but separated by a fundamental lack of respect. The very walls of Windsor, which had seen centuries of genuine royal drama, were now witness to a shallow PR-driven exercise in damage control that was failing in real time. The consequences of this single frozen second in time were far-reaching and devastating, serving as the definitive proof for the public that the rift was not a tabloid invention, but a cold, hard reality. When the image was finally released to the world, the reaction was instantaneous. The public didn't see a happy family, they saw a hostage situation. The scrutiny applied to Catherine's face, and William's stance was relentless, and the Sussexes' attempt to project privacy through a closed-door event backfired spectacularly by highlighting their isolation from the rest of the clan. This photograph became the blueprint for every future interaction, a series of strained, high-stakes encounters where the goal was no longer connection, but survival. It was the moment the mask didn't just slip, it fell off entirely, leaving the British public to contemplate the uncomfortable truth that their beloved monarchy was being hollowed out from the inside by a feud that had no end in sight. As the session ended and the cameras were packed away, the air in the room didn't clear. It curdled. The exit of the Cambridge family was reportedly swift and silent, a retreating army that had completed a distasteful mission and was eager to return to the sanity of their own home. There were no lingering goodbyes, no warm embraces, and certainly no plans for tea. The Archie christening frieze had been successfully captured for posterity, a permanent record of the day. The future of the monarchy looked into the eyes of its greatest modern disruption and blinked. For Catherine, the ordeal of the photograph was over, but the psychological scars of that afternoon would linger, informing her cautious and distant approach to the Sussexes for years to come. She had learned the hard way that in the new Sussex era, even a holy christening was merely another opportunity for a public relations ambush, and she would never allow herself to be caught so off guard again. While the world's cameras were ostensibly trained on the infant in the lace gown, the true energy in that drawing room radiated from the man standing like a sentinel behind the sofa, Prince William. His posture was not that of a proud uncle, but of a man performing a grim diplomatic duty he found utterly distasteful. To those well-versed in the subtle cues of the House of Windsor, William's stance, shoulders squared, jaw tight, hands clasped in a protective fig-leaf position, suggested a nightclub bouncer more than a royal brother. This was a man who had reached his absolute limit with the Sussexes' perpetual cycle of grievance and demand. Behind that stoic, icy exterior, one can only imagine the boiling resentment of a future king who saw his family's ancient traditions being treated as a mere backdrop for a Hollywood publicity stunt. According to a well-placed source, the air between the two brothers was so frigid that it seemed to lower the temperature of the room, a silent, vibrating discord that made even the most seasoned courtiers feel like they were walking on shards of glass. William's inner monologue during those agonizing minutes was likely a catalogue of perceived betrayals and a fierce protective instinct toward his wife. He had watched Catherine endure months of subtle undermining and overt hostility, and seeing her forced into this performative tableau next to Meghan must have been a bitter pill to swallow. There was a sense, whispered by someone close to palace circles, that William viewed this entire event not as a religious milestone, but as a strategic ambush designed to force a show of unity that no longer existed. He wasn't just standing for a portrait, he was standing guard over the dignity of the institution he is destined to inherit, his very presence a silent protest against the Sussex way of doing business. The chasm between the brothers had moved beyond mere sibling rivalry into a fundamental clash of ideologies, duty versus self-interest, tradition versus celebrity, and William's face was the map of that war. The atmospheric pressure within the green drawing room was compounded by the fact that Harry, too, seemed to be vibrating with a defensive, almost combative energy. Far from the happy prince the public once adored, the Harry of 2019 was a man who saw enemies in every corner, even among his own blood. A source behind closed doors noted that Harry's eyes rarely met his brother's, and when they did, the exchange was devoid of any warmth, replaced instead by a hard, challenging stare. He seemed acutely aware of William's disapproval and met it with a defiant, us-against-the-world mentality that he had cultivated with Meghan. The tragedy of the moment was that the two men who had once been each other's primary support system through the darkest days of their lives were now communicating entirely through glares and a heavy, suffocating silence that spoke volumes more than any official statement ever could. This brotherly chasm was not just a private family matter. It was a constitutional crisis in the making, and everyone in that room felt the weight of it. The long-term consequences of this public yet private standoff were beginning to crystallize. The realization that the monarchy's future was being hamstrung by a domestic feud that showed no sign of thawing. For William, the christening was the final confirmation that his brother was truly gone, replaced by someone who prioritized the whims of his wife and the whims of the media over the stability of the crown. According to a well-meaning staff member, the interaction between the brothers after the photographer finished was non-existent. They didn't even share a nod of acknowledgement as they prepared to depart. It was the definitive end of the dynamic duo, a collapse of trust so total that it left the staff in a state of quiet shock, realizing they were witnessing the beginning of a long, cold exile. The pressure on the staff to maintain a sense of normalcy amidst this civil war was immense, with many feeling as though they were managing a ceasefire rather than a family celebration. The logistical challenges of keeping the two camps separate until the exact moment of the photograph required a level of strategic planning usually reserved for state funerals. One could sense the underlying anxiety of the household, the fear that a single misplaced word or a slightly too long silence would ignite a confrontation that would be impossible to hide from the public. This wasn't a family gathering. It was a high-stakes chess match where every move was calculated for maximum protection and minimum exposure. The domestic details provided by those within the inner circle suggest a house divided where loyalty was tested and the tension was so thick it was practically visible. As the Cambridges made their exit, the feeling of relief in their wake was reportedly palpable. For William, the ordeal was a necessary evil, a performance required to protect the image of the monarchy for one more day. But the cost to his personal peace was clearly visible. He left Windsor that day not with the joy of a new family member, but with the grim satisfaction of a task completed under duress. The long-term impact of this day would be the hardening of his heart toward the Sussexes. The Archie christening freeze was the point of no return for the Prince of Wales. He had seen enough to know that the bridge was not just burned, but the very foundations had been uprooted. The image of the two brothers, once inseparable, now stood as a haunting monument to what happens when duty and ego collide with such violent force. The narrative of that day, despite the Sussexes' best efforts to control it, became a story of what was missing: warmth, sincerity, and a shared future. The public, particularly the astute women of my generation who have seen decades of royal ups and downs, could see the truth written in the stiff necks and averted eyes of the two most powerful men in the room. It was a dark, cynical chapter in the royal saga, one where the blood is thicker than water mantra was proven to be a hollow sentiment in the face of such profound ideological betrayal. The christening of Archie Harrison should have been a bridge back to sanity, but instead, it served as the definitive icy border crossing into a new era of royal estrangement that would change the face of the monarchy forever. To understand the sheer audacity of that afternoon, one must look closely at the architects of the event, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. While the rest of the family appeared to be undergoing a form of refined torture, Harry and Meghan sat at the epicenter of the frame, projecting a brand of performative joy that felt remarkably hollow to the seasoned observer. This wasn't merely a christening. It was a theater of control, a meticulously scripted demonstration of their power to disrupt centuries of protocol in favor of their own modern sensibilities. Behind Meghan's practiced Hollywood-grade smile, there was a discernible air of triumph, the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had successfully forced the British monarchy to play by her rules, even if just for an afternoon. A source within the inner circle noted that Meghan's demeanor throughout the planning was that of a director rather than a devotee, treating the sacred traditions of the Church of England as though they were merely props on a soundstage designed to elevate her own personal narrative. The inner monologue of the Duchess during those moments must have been one of profound validation, a sense that she had finally outmaneuvered the men in gray suits and the stiff traditional expectations of her in-laws. By weaponizing the concept of privacy, demanding a closed-door ceremony while still requiring the presence of the future king and queen for the official record, she'd created a scenario where she held all the cards. According to a well-placed source, she viewed the discomfort of Catherine and William not as a family tragedy, but as a byproduct of their inability to evolve to her standards. There was a chilling level of calculation in the way the Sussexes managed the guest list in the media blackout. It was a calculated strike against the transparency that has long been the unspoken contract between the crown and the people. The atmosphere around them was one of defensive arrogance, a bubble of us against them that left the staff feeling like they were aiding and abetting a slow-motion coup against royal tradition. Harry, for his part, seemed to have fully adopted this bunker mentality, his expression in the portraits flickering between forced happiness and a lingering, combative edge. He was no longer the jovial, relatable prince of the people. He had become the stern enforcer of his wife's vision. A source behind closed doors observed that Harry spent much of the day checking his watch and eyeing the door as if he were guarding a high-value asset rather than celebrating his firstborn's spiritual birth. The pressure on him to bridge the gap between his heritage and his wife's ambitions must have been immense, yet he chose to double down on the latter, effectively turning his back on the very people who had supported him for 30 years. The tragedy, of course, is that he seemed to believe he was protecting his family, when in reality he was merely participating in their public isolation. The long-term consequences of this display of control were catastrophic for the Sussexes' reputation within the palace walls. By forcing the senior royals into this charade, they didn't just cause a day of awkwardness, they permanently eroded the foundation of trust that is required for a functional monarchy. A long-time family acquaintance remarked that after the Archie freeze, the senior royals realized that any private moment shared with the Sussexes was liable to be commodified or used as a weapon in their ongoing PR war. The theater of control might have won them that specific afternoon in Windsor, but it cost them their place in the heart of the family. They had shown their hand. They weren't interested in being part of the firm. They wanted to be the firm, and they were willing to make everyone else uncomfortable to prove it. The subtle eye-rolling of a source within the inner circle who watched the Sussexes attempt to direct the royals like extras on a television set was not just petty gossip. It was a reflection of a deep-seated professional disdain. The staff, many of whom have served the crown for decades, saw through the thin veneer of the private family moment to the cold, hard ambition underneath. They watched as Meghan and Harry prioritized the perfect shot over the perfect sentiment, ensuring that the image of Archie's christening would be a strategic asset for years to come. This was the moment the Sussexes' double life truly began to crumble, when the public started to see that the privacy they craved was actually just a tool for total narrative dominance. As we look back on those images today, the arrogance of that theater is breathtaking. They sat in the center of a room filled with history, surrounded by people who had dedicated their lives to duty, and they treated it like a backdrop for a Netflix sizzle reel. The atmosphere was heavy with the realization that the Sussexes were no longer playing the same game as the rest of the family. While William and Catherine were thinking about the next 50 years of the monarchy, Harry and Meghan were thinking about the next 24 hours of news cycle. It was a fundamental mismatch of values that would inevitably lead to the final bitter exit from royal life we all witnessed just months later. The most glaring omission from the official portrait of that day was, of course, the absence of the two figures who represent the very soul of the British monarchy, Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, and the Duke of Edinburgh. While the official explanation offered by the palace was a convenient diary clash involving a long-planned weekend at Sandringham, The void they left in that room spoke with a volume that no press release could ever hope to dampen. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like a simple scheduling error, but to those who understand the intricate silent chess game of royal protocol, it was a devastatingly clear message. A well-placed source later confirmed that while the Queen had indeed missed Prince Louis's christening previously, the circumstances surrounding Archie's were entirely different, shrouded as they were in a cloud of Sussex-driven secrecy and a blatant disregard for the traditions the monarch had spent her entire life defending. The atmosphere in the room without the Queen's stabilizing presence felt untethered and strangely hollow, as if the moral compass of the family had been intentionally removed to allow the Sussexes' theater to play out without adult supervision. According to a source behind closed doors, there was a feeling among senior staff that the Queen and Prince Philip's absence was pointedly chosen, a graceful but firm withdrawal from an event that had become more about celebrity management than a holy sacrament. The inner monologue of the Queen, a woman who prioritized duty above all else, was likely one of weary disappointment. She had reportedly grown increasingly tired of the constant negotiations required to accommodate Meghan's controlling behavior, as one palace insider put it, and felt that attending would merely validate a style of operation that she found fundamentally embarrassing to the institution. By staying away, she was not just honoring a prior engagement, she was asserting the primacy of the crown over the whims of a single disruptive couple. The long-term consequences of this absence cannot be overstated, as it signaled the definitive beginning of the Sussexes' isolation from the inner core of the monarchy. Someone close to palace circles remarked that the Queen's refusal to rearrange her schedule for Archie's big day, despite the Sussexes reportedly shifting their own dates to try and catch her, was the first public indicator that the generous and understanding phase of her relationship with Meghan was coming to a cold, hard end. It was a masterclass in royal signaling, a polite, smiling no that reverberated through the corridors of power, letting it be known that even the most favored grandson could not dictate terms to the sovereign. This echoing void in the photograph served as a permanent reminder that while Meghan might control the lighting and the photographer, she could never control the ultimate arbiter of royal legitimacy. The pressure on Prince Charles and Prince William in their mother's absence was palpable, as they were forced to act as the primary representatives of a family that felt increasingly fractured. Without the Queen there to act as a buffer, the friction between the brothers was exposed to the elements, raw and unfiltered. A well-meaning staff member recalled that the tension in the room was so high that many were relieved the monarch wasn't there to witness the brittle and artificial nature of the gathering. It was as if the family knew that the Queen's presence would have demanded a level of genuine warmth that they were simply no longer capable of faking. Her absence provided a somber reality check. The Fab Four era was dead, and the new era of the firm versus the Sussexes had officially begun, marked by a silence from the top that was more eloquent than any speech. This tactical distancing by the Queen was a harbinger of the slimming down of the monarchy that would eventually see Harry and Meghan relegated to the sidelines of the institution. By choosing Sandringham over Windsor that weekend, the Queen was subtly redefining what and who mattered to the future of the crown. The inner circle understood that the Queen's patience was not infinite, and the Archie christening freeze was the moment she drew a line in the Windsor sand. The message was clear. Tradition would not be bargained with, and the sovereign's time would not be wasted on events that prioritized personal brand over public duty. For Meghan, who had spent months trying to mold the royal world to her image, the empty space where the Queen should have been was a chilling reminder of her own ultimate lack of power within the system. As the day concluded and the official portraits were prepared for release, the missing monarch became the central talking point, undermining the very image of unity the Sussexes had so desperately tried to craft. It was the ultimate royal snub, delivered with the impeccable politeness that was the Queen's trademark. The public realization that the great-grandparents had better things to do than attend the christening of Harry's first child was a blow to the Sussexes' carefully managed narrative of being the new, modern face of the family. Instead, they looked like outliers, a branch of the family that had drifted so far from the trunk that it was no longer receiving the life-giving sap of royal approval. The silence from the throne was deafening, and in that silence, the true gravity of the situation began to sink in for everyone involved. The family was no longer whole, and the Queen was making sure the world knew it. The narrative of that day took an even more calculated turn with the strategic inclusion of Lady Jane Fellows and Lady Sarah McCorquodale, the sisters of the late Princess Diana. To the uninitiated, their presence seemed a touching tribute to Harry's mother, but to those within the inner circle, it was seen as a weaponization of a ghost. By placing Diana's family in the heart of the official portrait, the Sussexes were attempting to wrap themselves in the protective cloak of her enduring legacy, essentially signaling to the world that they were the true heirs to her spirit of rebellion and outsider status. This was not merely a family gesture, it was a PR masterstroke designed to shield Meghan from criticism by constantly drawing a parallel between her and the martyred Princess of Wales. A source behind closed doors whispered that this move felt like a pointed provocation towards Prince William, who has always been fiercely protective of his mother's memory and deeply wary of anyone, including his own brother, using her image for personal gain or political leverage. The atmosphere in the room during this tribute was reportedly laden with an unspoken accusation. One could almost feel the weight of the past pressing down on the present as two very different visions of Diana's legacy collided. Catherine, sitting mere feet away, was undoubtedly aware of the comparison being forced upon her. According to someone close to palace circles, Catherine's inner monologue was one of quiet resilience, refusing to be drawn into a competitive display of who is more like Diana. In a subtle but powerful countermove, the Princess of Wales chose to wear the Collingwood pearl and diamond earrings, the very ones Diana had worn to Harry's own christening in 1984. It was a silent, elegant assertion of her rank and her own deep, respectful connection to the woman whose shoes she is destined to fill. This was a battle of symbols, played out in diamonds and pearls, a sophisticated chess game where every accessory was a move and every guest was a pawn in a struggle for the moral high ground. The inner monologue of Prince William, in the face of this strategic deployment of his aunts, was likely one of weary frustration. He has spent his entire adult life trying to ensure his mother is remembered for her humanity rather than her grievances, and seeing her sisters used as a buffer for the Sussexes' us against the world narrative must have felt like a betrayal of her true history. A well-placed source noted that William's interaction with his maternal aunts was polite but distant, his focus remaining firmly on Catherine and the duty at hand. He knew that the presence of the Spencer family would be interpreted by the press as a validation of Harry and Meghan's outsider status, a narrative he finds fundamentally dishonest given the immense support the family had initially extended to them. The long-term consequence of this was a further hardening of the lines between the two brothers, as William began to see Harry's use of their mother's legacy as a tool for manipulation rather than a genuine act of remembrance. The pressure on the Spencer sisters themselves cannot be ignored, as they found themselves caught in the crossfire of a sibling war they likely didn't fully comprehend the depth of at the time. To a source within the inner circle, it was clear they were there out of genuine love for their nephew, but their presence was cynically exploited by the Sussex PR machine to suggest a fracture within the royal family that didn't necessarily extend to the Spencers. This created a jarring dissonance in the photograph, the old guard of the Spencers standing alongside the new rebels of the Sussexes, while the future of the monarchy, William and Catherine, looked on with a mixture of stoicism and disdain. It was a cluttered, emotionally fraught tableau that attempted to bridge a gap that was already too wide to be crossed, leaving the viewer with a sense of unease rather than the intended warmth of a family reunion. As the cameras flashed, the battle for Diana's legacy was essentially frozen in time, providing a permanent record of the moment the Sussexes attempted to hijack the narrative of the People's Princess for their own ends. The long-term impact of this strategic inclusion has been a growing public fatigue with the constant Diana comparisons, which many feel are used as a get-out-of-jail-free card for the couple's more controversial decisions. A well-meaning staff member recalled that the conversation in the room remained focused on the child, but the elephant in the room was the ghost of a mother who would have been devastated to see her son so divided. The irony was palpable. In their attempt to honor a woman who valued connection, the Sussexes had created an event that was the very definition of a disconnect. The final result of this maneuvering was a portrait that felt like a house of mirrors, where every participant was reflecting a different version of the truth. For the public, particularly those of us who remember the vibrant, unified image of the young princes with their mother, seeing this fractured version was a sobering reality check. The Archie christening freeze wasn't just about a baby. It was about who gets to claim the history of the house. By the time the session ended, it was clear that while Meghan and Harry had the aunts, William and Catherine had the future. The attempt to weaponize the past had only served to highlight how isolated the Sussexes had become from the reality of their present situation. It was a hollow victory, a strategic move that won the photo but lost the war for the hearts and minds of the British public. The moment the heavy oak doors of the green drawing room finally swung open to signal the end of the session, the collective relief among the senior royals was, by all accounts, almost audible. For William and Catherine, the transition from the frozen artificial smiles of the portrait to the sanctuary of their waiting car was less of a departure and more of a tactical retreat. According to a well-placed source, the couple barely exchanged a word until the car doors were safely sealed, finally allowing the mask of royal duty to slip and reveal the sheer, bone-deep exhaustion of having spent hours in a psychological pressure cooker. The inner monologue of the Princess of Wales in that moment was likely one of profound disappointment. She had walked into Windsor hoping for a glimmer of familial reconciliation, and walked out realizing she had merely provided the set dressing for a Sussex production. The realization was dawning that no matter how much she gave, or how many times she swallowed her pride for the sake of the institution, the demands of the couple across the hallway would only continue to escalate. Back within the Sussex camp at Frogmore Cottage, however, the atmosphere was reportedly one of frantic, high-stakes analysis. Before the ink was even dry on the digital files, the Sussex machine was already at work, dissecting every frame with the precision of a diamond cutter. A source behind closed doors noted that Meghan was particularly focused on how she was perceived, obsessing over the lighting, the positioning, and the overall vibe of the image. There was no room for the messy, organic joy of a family gathering. Everything had to be a curated statement of power. Yet, as the photos were released to the global media, the response was not the adoration they had anticipated. Instead, the internet and the tabloids immediately began to do exactly what we are doing now. They looked past the baby and straight into the eyes of the adults. The immediate aftermath was a PR disaster of the highest order, as the public didn't see a modern monarchy, but a family in the throes of a Cold War. The pressure on the palace press offices in the hours following the release was immense, as they were besieged by questions that no amount of official phrasing could adequately answer. Why did Catherine look like she was sitting on a bed of nails? Why was William standing like he was expecting a punch? A source within the inner circle revealed that the damage control meetings were tense, with courtiers privately acknowledging that the Sussexes' insistence on total secrecy had backfired spectacularly, creating a vacuum that the public filled with entirely accurate suspicions. The long-term consequence of this afternoon was the final shattering of the palace's ability to manage the narrative of the two brothers. The image was out, the truth was written on their faces, and no amount of sources close to the couple could put the genie back in the bottle. As the evening wore on, the domestic details emerging from Windsor suggested a family that had physically separated as quickly as humanly possible. There was no grand christening tea where the brothers clinked glasses, no intimate family dinner to toast the health of the new arrival. Instead, there was a stark, echoing silence. A longtime family acquaintance remarked that this was the night the private realization took hold among the senior staff. The monarchy was now effectively operating as two separate and increasingly hostile courts. The atmosphere of trust, which is the very oxygen of the royal household, had been sucked out of the room by the Sussexes' relentless focus on their own image. One could sense the frustration of the staff who had worked for decades to maintain the dignity of the crown, only to see it treated as a mere accessory in a Californian-style branding exercise. The psychological toll on Harry, too, began to manifest in a heightened state of defensiveness. According to someone close to palace circles, he was reportedly fuming at the early social media commentary that pointed out the obvious tension. Rather than reflecting on the state of his family, he allegedly blamed the stiffness of his brother and sister-in-law for ruining the moment, further entrenching the us versus them mentality that has characterized his life ever since. This was the moment the Archie christening freeze moved from a private quarrel to a public tragedy. The inner monologue of a man who had once been the life of the party was now one of brooding resentment, a sense that he was being sabotaged by the very people who were meant to be his bedrock. Looking back, the immediate aftermath of that 2019 christening was the definitive end of the Fab Four as a functional unit. The world had seen the cracks and the family had felt the earthquake. The consequences were not just for the headlines of the next day, but for the history books of the next century. It was the point at which the stiff upper lip of the Cambridges met the open heart, or perhaps just open ambition, of the Sussexes, and the result was a permanent icy stalemate. The drawing room at Windsor may have been cleaned and the cameras packed away, but the toxic residue of that afternoon would linger, poisoning every interaction that followed until the final inevitable break. As we look back through the long, cold lens of history, it is now abundantly clear that the Archie christening was the definitive point of no return, the moment the drawbridge was finally and firmly hoisted. This was the last time the House of Windsor would attempt to project a united front in a private, sacred setting without the heavy guard of absolute paranoia. The Archie christening freeze wasn't just a collection of awkward poses. It was the final exhale of an era. According to a well-placed source, the absolute collapse of trust following that afternoon was so total that the Cambridges and Sussexes would never again share a meal or a moment of genuine levity behind closed doors. The inner monologue of the senior royals had shifted from, "How do we fix this?" to "How do we survive this?" It was a chilling realization for a family built on the continuity of generations, to find that their youngest branch had become a source of systemic rot. The long-term consequences of that toxic atmosphere are visible in every subsequent royal event, from the icy pews of the Platinum Jubilee to the rigid, distant interactions at the late Queen's funeral. The Sussexes' strategy of weaponizing their personal narrative, which began in earnest that afternoon in the Green Drawing Room, ultimately led to a life of self-imposed exile and a relentless stream of lucrative yet deeply damaging media disclosures. A source behind closed doors notes that for William and Catherine, the memory of that day serves as a permanent cautionary tale, a reminder that in the modern era, even the most private family sanctums can be turned into a stage for a global PR war. The psychological scars of that afternoon have dictated the ironclad boundaries the Princess of Wales has maintained ever since, ensuring that her family is never again used as a prop for those who prioritize celebrity over service. The pressure of that day also fundamentally altered the trajectory of Harry's relationship with his homeland. By allowing a religious milestone to be dictated by the frantic demands of Hollywood-style image management, he signaled to the British people that his priorities had shifted irrevocably westward. Someone close to palace circles remarked that the Sussex way of doing things, characterized by that peculiar mix of secrecy and self-promotion, was ultimately the very thing that made their position within the monarchy untenable. They tried to have the crown and the camera, the title and the total control, and in doing so, they lost the one thing that truly matters in royal life, the quiet, steady trust of the family and the nation. The freeze was the harbinger of Megxit, a clear sign that the Sussexes were no longer compatible with the rhythm of the British state. Today, those photographs stand as a haunting monument to a family that could no longer even fake civility for the sake of a child's future. To the women of my generation, who value the sanctity of family and the importance of duty, the Archie christening frieze remains a poignant reminder of how quickly a legacy can be tarnished by ego. The atmosphere of Windsor that day, once filled with the promise of a new generation, has been replaced in our memories by the image of a future queen, sitting in stiff, silent agony, desperate to escape a room filled with the people she was supposed to call family. It is a tragedy played out in silk and lace, a dark chapter in the Windsor saga that proves that even the most glittering of palaces can become a prison when trust is replaced by suspicion. As we close this chapter on the secrets of Windsor, one is left to reflect on the high price of living one's truth when that truth involves the dismantling of others. The monarchy has survived for 1,000 years because it understands that the individual is always secondary to the institution, a lesson the Sussexes chose to ignore to their own ultimate detriment. The frieze that began in 2019 has never thawed. It has only hardened into a permanent glacier of estrangement. It serves as a stark warning that while you can stage manage a photograph, you cannot stage manage a heart, and the truth will always find a way to leak out from the corners of even the most practiced smile. Leave your thoughts below. I read every word you write, and I'm curious to know if you, like me, saw the truth in Catherine's eyes the moment those photos were released. If you value this unvarnished, cynical, yet necessary look at the reality behind the royal facade, do ensure you are subscribed and share this with those who appreciate the truth over the Hollywood spin. Until next time, I remain your observer in the corridors of power.